And we are live. Thank you so much for joining this episode of the Connection Loop podcast. Today we have Josh with us, and Josh is an author and a speaker and a business owner and all things inspiring. So, Josh, if you could please start with a short bio and let's get into the topic.
Awesome. Hey, thanks so much. Pleasure to be with you. So I'm a weird guy. Started my career as a jazz guitarist. I still play regularly today. Put myself through college playing music. But I got bitten by the entrepreneurial bug early. At age 20, I started my first tech company. And over the last 30 years, I've started, built, and sold 5 technology companies. I then got into venture capital and loved the idea of helping others build successful businesses. So I helped get about 100 startups off the ground, a couple winners and a couple, of course, struggles, but a lot of fun nonetheless. My real passion, though, all in is human creativity. How do you harness creativity, not just for the sake of it, but to drive better outcomes in our businesses and our lives? So I've had the chance to write 4 books on the topic, and I now speak all over a research company on helping companies build cultures of innovation.
So a couple of questions just to get started out with here. Number one is, when you say that you got bit by the entrepreneurial bug, you were in a creative situation, you are a jazz musician. When did you decide to make that transition? What was that bug? What was the catalyst? Was it a person? Was it a feeling? What was it that hit you?
Well, I was, as mentioned, a musician, but I was also a little bit of a tech nerd, or maybe a lot of bit of a tech nerd. So
Okay.
this is like in the 80s. I had like an Atari 800 and I would write code on it. And I just was on a bulletin board, which is the precursor to the internet. And so in 1990, I was 20 years old in college, and you couldn't go buy a cheap computer at Best Buy at the time. You couldn't just go to Dell.com and order a computer. But I realized there was this weird market dynamic because I was kind of a nerd, and I would look at computer catalogs, and I could mail order individual components and assemble a computer and still sell it for way less than someone could buy at retail, and I could make a profit. So I'd never taken a business class. I didn't know what I was doing, but I was like, hey, if I could figure out jazz, maybe I could improvise my way through this. So I started this little company in college and started selling computers and made a little bit of money, made a ton of mistakes, but I just fell in love with the idea of creating something out of nothing. And frankly, it was just like jazz. It was literally like creating something out of nothing, just using different instruments.
Love that. Now, there's this kind of stigma, that the stereotype, if you will, that, some creative people are not great business people. You hear that a lot, whether it's artists or musicians, poets, ventriloquists. It's an unfortunate stereotype that exists. Now, maybe there's some truth to it, because when you go and you learn how to become a ventriloquist, it's not exactly where you're taking business classes. Now, that said, what would you say to listeners about how to be creative, but then also how to be a good business person at the same time? How to have that church versus state, how to not mess up your creative juices, but also get your rent paid?
Yeah, I think that those are much more aligned than may seem obvious. Part of the issue is that we attribute certain types of creativity with some, like for example, we say, okay, if you paint, you're creative, but if you're in finance, you're not creative. So we assume that a job title or a role equals your level of creativity, which is nonsense. You can have very creative musicians that play in symphony orchestras and play the notes with precision, but don't create much of anything. And you can have wildly creative accountants and lawyers and such. So I think we have to get past, what does creativity look like? It doesn't
Totally
have to
agree.
look like molding out of clay or doing interpretive dance. We can be creative in any role in a business setting. Second thing I would say is that today, more than ever, I would say that creativity is no longer a nice to have. It's mission critical.
Yes.
Maybe in the past, the quote unquote hard skills of the past would carry someone through their career or business wins. But today, those hard skills have become commoditized and outsourced and automated. And so the one thing that's left standing, the real differentiator, is human creativity. And it shows up in different ways. It's not necessarily painting on the walls with purple crayons. It's creative problem solving. It's inventive thinking. It's finding creative ways to sell your product or to serve a customer need, or to recruit, or to drive efficiencies in your factory. So we can use creativity in non-traditional ways in the business setting. And I would argue that in fact has become the most powerful resource at our disposal in these challenging and modern times.
I can't agree more with that. It's amazing how we look at so many jobs getting outsourced now. As the father of a soon to be 8-year-old boy, I ask myself, what is it that I can teach him? How can I empower him so that when he gets to be 18 or 24 or 35, that he has a certain skill set that makes him valuable and that makes him happy, right? And on his purpose. And, I asked myself, well, is it programming? Is it, reading? Is it business skills? What is it? And for me, I have come with these three mantras that I'm really sticking with, which is number one is creativity. It's thinking outside the box. I really appreciate how you present this idea that all functions, all jobs can be creative. It's about solving problems. Number two is empathy, is actually connecting with the struggles of people or businesses, because when you understand struggles, that's how you can understand solutions. And then I would say the last one is just generally acquiring those hard skills that are required to do what you need to do. Those obviously can get automated, they can get outsourced, but by having those hard skills allows you to do the work, to execute. What would you say to your 21-year-old self? What is it that you know now that you did not know back then?
I'm lucky that I have a 23-year-old and a 21-year-old. I have a son and daughter, and then I also have 4-year-old twins. So I actually get to say that to real breathing people. I totally agree with you in those three categories. In reverse order, first of all, the hard skills. Maybe it's a different approach. Like if we're going to be in a craft, for sure we need to learn the mechanics of the craft. So you and I play music, and you have to learn, what is a downbeat and how do you play a scale or whatever. So you're right. We absolutely need to learn the mechanics of the craft. But things like rote memorization that you study for a test and then forget 5 minutes later, I think serves nobody, and it doesn't do anything. Think about, but the other two are so crucial, creativity and empathy. Why don't we have classes like that in school? And I'm not blaming teachers. Teachers are heroes, but we have a system that is completely antiquated and out of date, not preparing kids for what they need for the future. I think that you should have a mandatory class called Making Mistakes. What's a good mistake? What's a bad mistake? How do you learn from them? What's a responsible risk versus a not responsible risk? You mentioned empathy. Why not have a course on empathy and compassion? Awesome. So I think creative problem solving, again, so critical. But then you look what we're taught. Like I learned long division by hand. I'm sure you did too. In my career in 30 years, I've literally created 10,000 jobs, bought and sold companies, hundreds of millions of dollars of transactions. I've never used long division by hand once. So I'm not trying to beat up on any teachers or anything, but I do think that we're in desperate need of reform to prepare our kids so that they can thrive, not in the yesteryear, but in the modern era.
Phenomenal. Now you wrote a book. In fact, you wrote 4 books, but recently you wrote Big Little Breakthroughs, How Small Everyday Innovations Drive Oversized Results. Take me through this process.
Yeah, man, thank you so much. I'm really proud of this book. I poured my heart and soul into it. I spent over 1,000 hours in research and interviews with CEOs and billionaires and celebrity entrepreneurs and Grammy award-winning musicians and lots of normal people. But the idea behind the book is it sort of flips the principle of innovation upside down. Most of us think that you have to swing for the fences and take a moonshot and change the universe or whatever. Nothing wrong with that. But I think a more pragmatic approach is to do the opposite, to cultivate high volumes of small, everyday ideas. Think of them as micro innovations. And here's why. First of all, it's way more accessible to more people. Most of us can take a small bet. Maybe we can't take $1 billion bet. You are learning critical skills in the same time. Those small wins add up to big wins, and you are taking way less risk. So I think it's actually a better way of thinking about innovation. And again, you can apply it in every area of your life, from how do you cool off a glass of white wine to how do you close a deal and how do you, engage with your kids or your community. I think we lost you audio there.
Now, would you say that the 4 books that you've written, they all sort of are driven from a similar theme, a similar place, or would you say that these kind of came to you in very different manifestations?
They did all come from a similar foundation. Thank you for asking that. And it's a core belief, and I actually feel like it's a purpose or even a calling. I don't mean to sound like a Hallmark card, but here's the way I look at the world. I look at the world that we have 7 billion people with dormant creative capacity of varying degrees, me included, and I study creativity. And the thing is that the answers to the problems that matter most to us, whether it's advancing in our companies or solving social injustice or creating equity and fairness and eradicating suffering and curing disease, those answers lie inside us, and they're trapped in there. And so if I can help people unlock their creative ability, the world is just a better place. It drives better business outcomes, education outcomes, healthcare outcomes, environmental outcomes. And so that's been my core belief belief all along that all human beings have creative capacity. And so all 4 of the books that I've written are tied to that general theme. But they did change over the years. Like the first book was called Disciplined Dreaming. It was more systematically, how do you cultivate creativity? The second book was really focused on reinvention. How do you reinvent yourself or your business? The third book, I studied hackers as a metaphor. I went deep inside the world of cybercrime and studied how hackers think and act, not to promote criminal activity, of course, but to say, what can we learn from it and apply it in a legitimate way? But I do think this last book, Big Little Breakthroughs, is certainly the best thing I've written. I'm really proud of it and excited to share it with the world.
Very cool. Now, in addition to being an author, you're a venture capitalist. Talk to us about that process. What are the types of bets that you're making on? Are you more into do you bet on the jockey? Do you have a specific sector that you invest? Like what's your sort of mix when you make a choice?
Yeah, so I focus on early stage tech, mostly software. Right now I'm focusing on future of work, future of learning, future of sustainability, and future of security. All of those are obviously very big categories, but I think that's where there's terrific economic gains to be had and the opportunity to make the world a better place in each of those. For me, I don't want to invest in a company that makes French fries or something that hurts the world. I only want to invest in things that help the world. But in terms of the jockey and the horse, you bring up a great question. And I actually did an experiment. I'll share it with you. So almost at the exact same time, within a month of each other, I made 2 investments, 2 different companies. Each was $600,000, by the way. One was an A team and a C idea. The other was a C idea and an A team. Here's what happened. Like clockwork, the A team managed to take the C idea and make it an A idea. That became a wildly successful investment. The A idea managed to get screwed up quickly by the C team, and I lost every penny. So I really do think, especially in early stage, it is a lot about the people, but not what you might think, by the way. It's not who's the most charismatic or who has the boldest, vision or the loudest voice. It's those that are open-minded, those that are focused on delivering real results, those that have humility. And so it's not always the brazen entrepreneur that you want to bet on. For me, anyway, it's oftentimes the soft-spoken one.
So well said. It is true. The more successful, the more intelligent you are, sometimes the more humble you are. Now, that's not always the case, but emotional quotient is a big factor here. Now, you have taught applied creativity for over 10 years now at the University of Michigan. What is applied creativity? And if you could just quickly give us a crash course in us, if that's possible.
Sure. I'm not currently doing anything with Michigan, although I'm very close to the faculty and students there. My daughter just graduated from University of Michigan, by the way. But
Nice.
You're right. I do teach that principle all over the world. I've actually delivered over 1,000 keynotes over the years. And so to me, applied creativity is the notion that, so creativity for the sake of it is it could be artistically compelling. If I created a painting or maybe I made a musical tune, you could possibly commercialize it, but there's intrinsic value more so than like commercial value or utility value. So to me, when I think about applied creativity, it's taking the principles of creativity, which is sort of inventing stuff that doesn't exist today, but applying it where there's utility value. Is it adding value to someone's life? Is it making the world better? Is there a commercially viable idea underneath it? So, a lot of times when you talk to leaders, they say, creativity, I don't need creativity, I need results. And applied creativity is using creativity to drive results.
That's it right there. I mean, you just summed it up, because creativity is how we solve problems. It's in fact why I believe we're on this planet, to solve problems. Without listening, we can't learn about those problems. So how important is it to be a good listener in order to be creative? Now, being creative, I think, in a bubble is one thing. And I've done that for years of my life. In fact, every time I pick up my guitar, I'm being creative in my tiny little bubble, especially since I'm not recording. But when I'm being creative to solve problems, that's an entirely different thing. So I really appreciate how you articulate that.
You talk about it. This is also a fascinating debate. Are you better off being creative, like the lone wolf creative, where, Hemingway locks himself in a log cabin and writes the great American novel? Or are you better off co-creating in a collaborative environment? The truth is there's not one right answer. There's different flavors for different people and different ways to be creative at different times. I can just share with you what's worked for me. So again, creativity is such a broad term. There are some creative acts which are more like Genesis, where you're creating something out of nothing. For me, sometimes I actually like the co-creation process better. Another creative process, though, is the process of revisions. And that is equally creative, but for me anyway, I tend to do that more in a solitary format. But back to music, a passion that you and I both share. So jazz to me, which is one of the reasons I truly love the art form, is it's real-time innovation. You're making up 99% of what you play is happening spontaneously, and you're composing art and performing art at the same time, which adds a whole different dimension. I don't think there's you don't usually do that, like, for example, with oil on canvas. And furthermore, it's a collaborative process. It's just like you and I didn't script our conversation today. You're saying something and I'm kind of building off of it, or vice versa. So here's what happens in jazz. I play a little riff on the guitar that I make up, and let's say it's not very good. But then the bass player hears it and says, "Ooh, I can take that to the next level," and picks what I did and takes it to the next level. Then the drummer hears a little rhythm in that, grabs it on a cymbal. And then the sax player hears what's going on, takes that little grain of an idea, rips a killer sax solo to the delight of the audience. We'd say, well, who created that? And really, we all created that. We all participated in the creative process. And so I find that when you're really creating something out of nothing, if you can get with like-minded people and there's not a lot of fear or judgment in the room, that co-creation, riffing off of one another, can be absolutely magical.
You know, that collaboration is truly why I love music. It's actually why I love collaboration. It's because a bad idea can get turned into a good idea if the person is patient, if the person will just say, I'm going to try to iterate that. I'm going to try to iterate that. How often does it happen where someone comes up with a mediocre idea and then it gets shot down? What a lost opportunity when that happens. When someone says, what about this? And then the other person says, that's a terrible idea. That's just a starting point, And I think these starting points in life is where some of the most magnificent ideas come from. What is required in this mix is to be vulnerable. Now, talk to me about vulnerability a little bit. How have you been vulnerable in your life? How can we all become better, vulnerable people so that we can connect to people, so that we can progress and evolve?
Well, you're exactly right that ideas get extinguished too quickly. And we see this all the time. There's 5 people in a room. One comes up with an idea and the other 4 become the idea police. And they tell you all the reasons it's never going to work. And the boss is going to hate it. And you look foolish. And so actually it turns out that fear, not natural talent, fear is the single biggest blocker of creative output. We all are innately creative as human beings, but that fear, even from well-intentioned bosses or parents, gets in the way and it dilutes our best creative thinking. So the way you can solve that is a couple things. One is, you mentioned vulnerability. I do think it's important to be vulnerable, but you have to feel safe to be vulnerable. In other words, if I don't feel safe, in front of a firing squad, I thought I could try to be vulnerable, but I don't feel safe because that's scary to me. So I think it's more important that we as leaders create environments where people can be vulnerable, but it's safe to be vulnerable. And the way we do that is, as leaders, try to remove the fear as best as we can through rituals and rewards. I can give you lots of examples of that. I mean, one fun example is that there's a company that I worked with that every year they do a Failure of the Year award. Big banquet. They celebrate other stuff, the team member of the year, the project of the year, but they also celebrate the failure of the year, which goes for the team or individual that had a great idea. The numbers made sense. They went for it, didn't work out at all, but good for them. And they get a standing ovation instead of getting fired. And so again, think about the message that sends into this company, that it's okay to be vulnerable, that fear has left the building. The other thing I would just quickly add is that if you're doing a brainstorming technique, brainstorming is a terribly outdated technique. It was invented in 1958. I don't even like the term. And so I developed a whole series of actually 13 that I cover in the book of much more modern, more productive techniques. And the techniques themselves can remove the fear and bring that vulnerability out to allow us to drive better creative outputs.
And take us through that process a little bit. How can we rethink brainstorming?
Yeah, so I think of it as outdated technology, really. It's like if you were trying to use a rotary phone or something, that would be kind of silly. And so I invented these, I call them idea jamming instead of brainstorming. And I'll give you an example of them. So let's say, so one of my favorites is called role storming, R-O-L-E. Role storming is brainstorming, but in character. So if I'm normally in a brainstorm and I'm intimidated by my colleagues, I'm going to share my safe ideas and hold my crazy ones back. But if I'm role storming and I'm pretending that I'm Steve Jobs, no one's going to laugh at me for coming up with a big idea. In other words, I'm not personally responsible for the ideas that I generate. It's just Steve coming up with an idea. So the way it works is really simple. Each person in the session chooses their own character. You could be a movie star, you could be a supermodel, you could be a villain, you could be a literary figure, you could whatever. And each person, you have to stay in character. So you're brainstorming as if you're Oprah or as if you're Leonardo da Vinci. And what we find is that simple shift in technique can liberate creative abilities because you're no longer, again, responsible. There's no backfire from coming up with an idea that doesn't pass muster.
Mm-hmm. So good. Now I see this quote here. Great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Vincent Van Gogh. Powerful.
Yeah, that's the principle behind Big Little Breakthroughs. Most of us think that creativity is this single lightning bolt from the heavens, and we're like, oh my God, I got the killer idea. And then 5 minutes later, a limousine is waiting to whisk you off to fame and fortune. And you know this from building a business. It's not that at all. Initial ideas are important, but it's the hundreds or thousands of little additional micro innovations along the way that bring that core idea to life. So actually the cover of the book, Big Little Breakthroughs, it was based on pointillism. And so it's actually individual little dots, like a little green dot, a little yellow dot. Any one of us could put those dots on there, no problem. That's what a big little breakthrough is. And it's the series of interconnected dots, though, that ultimately create a masterpiece. And that's how I think we should be thinking of creative breakthroughs, not as, again, a single gift anointed from the heavens, but rather the discipline day in and day out, little dots at a time add up to big things.
So well said. So well said. One of the things that I have found a lot of peace in when presenting an idea to a group of people, either in the real world or in the digital world, is actually embracing the objections as making that part of my pitch, where I have a doc, I have a presentation, but I have a separate notepad that says objections. And as people start to give those objections, I sort of document those. And what that does is that it helps me to iterate the product, because if those are my objections from the people that I'm working with internally, that's exactly what I'm probably going to face from the outside world. And that just helps me to improve it. And it also makes it so that I'm never offended because I asked you for objections and you brought those to me. And as a result, I was able to improve. So
that's so good. So anytime you want to improve in anything in life, certainly in creativity, you got to really examine, all right, what are the mindsets, what are the habits, and what are the tactics? So we talked about role storming as a tactical example, but in terms of mindsets, the back half of the book, I cover the 8 core obsessions or 8 core mindsets of everyday innovators. And one of them you made me think about, it's called fall in love with the problem, not the solution. In other words, often we're all solution oriented and we see a problem and we attack with the first idea we can come up with, and then we become married to it and we get tunnel visioned and we're unwilling to consider alternatives. Whereas the most innovative people and leaders and organizations instead really fall in love with the problem they're trying to solve. And they study it and they bathe in it and they look at it from different angles, and they never become overly committed to a particular way of solving it, but rather they become committed to solving that problem by whatever means in the best way possible necessary. So a lot of the mindsets that I cover, which are backed by real world stories and examples and such, are counterintuitive. They're the opposite of what we've been taught. But in fact, they bring forward the creativity that we seek.
Phenomenal. Well, Josh, tell me, where can we learn more about you? Where can we get your book? I know it's on Amazon. How can we connect with you on social channels?
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure to be with you today. I would really recommend people check out biglittlebreakthroughs.com. You can get the book there if you want, but even if you don't want to buy it, it's free. And there's a whole bunch of resources. There's a toolkit which we actually made a special thing. If you want, you can get free access. Just type in the word Dubb as your secret magic code, and you'll get access. But there's an assessment tool. There's downloadable worksheets. Just again, it's a whole support mechanism to bring your creativity to the surface. And if you want to connect with me personally, all my social handles are just my name, Josh Linkner, JoshLinkner. And of course, I have a website, as you might imagine, joshlinkner.com.
Very cool. And then on that website, you can just go to the toolkit link on the top navigation. And then in this, there's a form for the secret code where you can enter Dubb, D-U-B-B. So we will be putting that in the show notes. And Josh, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you.
Hey, one last quick thing. One of the hallmarks of creativity and innovation is not just coming an idea, betting it, and putting your whole life on it. It's the idea of experimentation, always trying new stuff. And I'm always trying to do new stuff. And so literally just before we were so impressed with Dubb, we're like, oh my God, we're going to try that. We got to give it an experiment. So we're excited to dive in and experiment with your amazing company and technology. And of course, I'll let you know how it goes, but I'm eagerly optimistic that it's going to be a raging success.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. So much of the process of building Dubb was about the things that we conversed about in this conversation, which is listening, which is iterating, which is being creative, trying to solve problems, being empathetic, connecting to people. So thank you so much for saying that, and I'm available for support anytime you need it.
Awesome. Thanks again.
Thanks.